The rain came down thin and cold over Charleston that late autumn evening, the kind of drizzle that clings to skin and refuses to be wiped away no matter how many times a hand passes over the face. Beneath the flickering sign of a corner convenience store, a woman named Amara Brooks stood waiting for her ride, her arms crossed against the chill, her breath rising in pale clouds that dissolved almost instantly into the wet night air. She had no idea that within the next 15 minutes, her ordinary evening would collapse into something that would be talked about across the entire city for weeks afterward. 2 police officers approached her without warning, their boots splashing through puddles gathered along the cracked pavement, their eyes sharp with a suspicion that had nothing to do with facts and everything to do with assumption. Before she could say a single word in her own defense, one of them raised his hand and struck her across the face. Right there on the sidewalk, in front of dozens of strangers who froze in stunned silence beneath their umbrellas. She did not scream, she did not fight back, and she did not raise her voice in protest even as the sting spread hot across her cheek. She simply lowered her eyes, reached into her pocket, and pulled out her phone, dialing a single number with fingers that trembled only slightly, betraying nothing else about the storm building quietly inside her. Only 8 words left her mouth, spoken low and even, barely audible above the patter of rain against the awning overhead. "Elias, I need you. Come now." 15 minutes later, the entire police department would come to understand, in ways none of them could yet imagine, that they had just made the worst mistake of their careers. Amara Brooks was 39 years old, a cybersecurity consultant who spent her days protecting sensitive networks for a defense contractor situated just outside the city limits. Work that demanded precision, patience, and an unshakable calm under pressure. Her colleagues often remarked on her composure, the way she never seemed to raise her voice, even when systems failed or deadlines tightened around her, and it was a trait that had served her well long before that night on the sidewalk. Few people at her office knew the full truth about her husband, because Amara had made a quiet habit over the years of keeping her personal life almost entirely private, tucked away from casual conversation. Her husband, Commander Elias Grant, was 41 years old, a Navy SEAL who had spent nearly 2 decades in active service to his country, currently home on a short leave, following a long and grueling deployment overseas. The two of them had built a life together, defined by discipline, mutual respect, and an unspoken understanding that some things simply were not meant to be shared with strangers or coworkers. Amara never mentioned his rank at dinner parties, never dropped hints about his service to impress new acquaintances, and never once used his reputation as a shield or a weapon in her daily life. That particular evening had begun the way so many others had, with a short errand to the pharmacy for cold medicine and a quick stop at the convenience store for coffee before the long drive home through the rain. Unbeknownst to her, only 20 minutes earlier, a car had been stolen from a parking lot 2 blocks away, the theft reported hastily by a rattled owner who had barely caught a glimpse of the person responsible. The description radioed to patrol units was maddeningly vague, nothing more than a black woman wearing a dark jacket somewhere near the shopping district, a description broad enough to fit half the women walking those streets that evening. A nervous witness, shaken by the excitement of the moment and eager to feel useful, pointed toward Amara as she stood beneath the store awning, insisting with great confidence that she matched the description, though in truth, the resemblance was paper-thin at best. Dispatch relayed the tip without hesitation or verification, and within moments 2 patrol cars were already speeding through the wet streets toward the very spot where Amara stood quietly waiting for her ride to arrive. She had done absolutely nothing wrong that evening, and she was certainly not thinking about crime or suspicion or danger as she waited beneath the flickering light. She was thinking, if anything, about the coffee cooling slowly in her hand and the rain soaking steadily through the sleeves of her jacket. Then, without warning, tires screeched sharply against the wet asphalt, and 2 police vehicles came to an abrupt, jarring stop directly in front of her, their headlights cutting bright, sharp beams through the misty evening air, illuminating her startled expression for anyone nearby to see. The officers who stepped out of those vehicles were Travis Nolan and Bryce Keegan, both experienced patrolmen with many years on the force, though that experience had clearly not translated into the patience or restraint the situation demanded of them. Nolan approached first, his hand resting near his belt, in a posture meant to project authority, his voice already sharp with command, before a single question had even been properly asked. He demanded identification immediately, cutting Amara off the moment she opened her mouth to calmly explain that she had simply been standing there waiting for a ride home. Keegan stood a few feet behind his partner, scanning the small crowd that had begun to gather near the store entrance, some of them already lifting their phones to record whatever might unfold next. Amara remained remarkably calm, despite the sudden intrusion, her voice steady, even as tension crackled visibly in the damp air around her. And she asked plainly why exactly she was being stopped and questioned. Nolan ignored her question entirely, repeating his demand for identification with rising hostility, as though her composure itself were somehow an act of defiance meant to provoke him further. A small crowd had gathered along the sidewalk by then, umbrellas tilted at odd angles, faces illuminated by the pale glow of the streetlights, watching a scene that was clearly beginning to spiral beyond anyone's control. A woman standing near the edge of the crowd, an older resident who had lived in that neighborhood for more than 30 years, later told a reporter that she had never seen an officer speak to anyone the way Nolan spoke to Amara that evening, his tone dripping, with an impatience that seemed to have nothing to do with the actual situation unfolding in front of him. Another bystander, a delivery driver who had stopped his van to watch, whispered to the person beside him that something about the whole encounter felt wrong from the very first moment, long before any hand was ever raised against anyone. Amara, for her part, kept glancing toward the store window, half expecting someone from inside to step out and confirm that she had done nothing more than purchase coffee and cold medicine only minutes earlier that evening. No one came forward yet, and the rain continued its steady rhythm against the pavement, each drop seeming to underscore the growing unease, rippling silently through the small crowd gathered there beneath the awning. Keegan shifted his weight from foot to foot, his eyes darting occasionally toward his partner, as though searching for some signal that this entire stop had gone further than either of them had originally intended it to go. Nolan's patience, thin as it already appeared to be, snapped entirely when Amara reached calmly for her identification inside her handbag, rather than immediately surrendering the entire bag for his inspection. He lunged forward without warning and yanked the bag from her hands with far more force than the situation could ever have reasonably required, sending her stumbling backward against the slick, rain-soaked pavement. Keegan moved a step closer, but did nothing to intervene, his silence somehow louder and more damning than any word he might have spoken in that moment of hesitation. Amara regained her footing quickly and tried once more, her voice still firm despite everything, insisting she had every right to understand why she was being treated this way on a public street. It was in that instant, with the crowd watching and the rain still falling steadily, that Nolan's hand shot out and struck her hard across the face, the crack of the slap cutting through the evening air like a sudden burst of thunder, silencing every conversation nearby. Phones that had been nervously recording now captured the moment in full, unmistakable clarity, every gasp and every frozen, horrified expression preserved for what would soon become undeniable evidence against him. Amara staggered slightly to one side, one hand rising instinctively to her stinging cheek, while the strangers gathered around her stood frozen in place, unable to fully process what they had just witnessed unfold before their eyes. She did not cry, and she did not raise her voice in anger, even as the sharp sting of the blow continued to spread warmly across her skin in the cold night air. Instead, Amara knelt down slowly and deliberately, retrieving her phone from where it had fallen onto the wet concrete during the scuffle, her movements calm and unshaken, despite everything that had just happened to her, in front of so many witnesses. The crowd around her remained utterly silent, some still recording, others simply staring in open disbelief at the officer who had just struck an unarmed, cooperative woman in broad view of dozens of strangers. Nolan barked another sharp order for her to remain still, seemingly unaware that the entire situation had already slipped irreversibly beyond his control the moment his hand made contact with her face. Amara's fingers moved across the screen with practiced, deliberate calm, dialing a single contact whose name she rarely spoke aloud in public settings, not out of secrecy, but out of simple humility. The rain continued to fall steadily around them, blending softly with the murmurs of the gathering crowd, as she pressed the phone to her ear and waited patiently for the call to connect somewhere across the city. Somewhere at a quiet naval facility, not far from where she stood, a phone began to ring on a desk, illuminated by a single dim lamp. Commander Elias Grant answered on the second ring, his voice calm and low, carrying the measured tone of a man trained over many years to remain composed no matter what circumstances surrounded him. Amara did not scream into the phone, nor did she launch into a lengthy explanation of everything that had unfolded across the last several tense minutes on that sidewalk. She simply said his name, followed by a handful of quiet words that somehow carried more weight than any lengthy story ever could have conveyed. "Elias, I need you," she said, her voice steady despite the pain still radiating from her cheek. Something in her tone, some subtle shift only a husband of many years might recognize immediately, told him at once that this was no ordinary call for help. He asked only one question in return, his voice suddenly sharper and more focused, stripped entirely of its usual casual warmth. "Did someone touch you?" he asked, each word deliberate and clipped. Amara answered with a single word, quiet but absolutely certain in its delivery. Yes. That single word was all it took for Commander Elias Grant to end the call without another word passing between them, his mind already moving several steps ahead toward action. He rose from his desk without a moment's hesitation, moving briskly through the quiet corridors of the naval facility, with the same controlled urgency he had once carried through far more dangerous environments overseas during his deployments. Within minutes he had changed into his tactical uniform, the same uniform he wore during routine readiness drills, though this was certainly no drill, and no operation sanctioned by any official command structure above him. He climbed into his vehicle and pulled quickly out of the base parking lot, his hands steady on the wheel despite the quiet storm building steadily behind his otherwise composed expression. Meanwhile, back at the convenience store, the situation had only continued to worsen, as Nolan and Keegan kept Amara detained, despite the mounting unease rippling visibly through the crowd of nearby onlookers. Keegan produced a set of handcuffs from his belt, suggesting aloud that they simply restrain her until the confusion could be properly sorted out later back at the station house. That suggestion drew audible gasps and murmurs of protest from several bystanders, still standing beneath the awning, watching the scene unfold with growing disbelief. Amara said nothing in response, her jaw held tight, her eyes fixed straight ahead, refusing to give either officer the satisfaction of seeing her break down in visible fear or anger before them. Then, cutting suddenly through the steady rain and the thick, uneasy tension, the low rumble of a large approaching vehicle grew louder, its headlights sweeping across the wet street, as a military-style vehicle rolled to a stop just beyond the parked patrol cars. The door opened, and Elias Grant stepped out directly into the rain, his presence immediately shifting the entire atmosphere of the scene, though he had not yet raised his voice or made a single threatening gesture toward anyone present. He walked straight to his wife, ignoring the two officers entirely for a long, tense moment, his eyes scanning her face carefully until he found the faint red mark still clearly visible along her cheek. He said nothing at first, simply reaching out to gently examine the injury with careful fingers, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly as full confirmation settled heavily over him. Nolan, apparently unbothered by the sudden arrival of this stranger, offered a smug and dismissive remark, asking sarcastically if Elias considered himself some kind of lawyer arriving to save the day. Elias answered simply, his voice flat, calm, and utterly controlled, despite everything he was clearly feeling in that moment. "No," he said. He then reached slowly into his jacket and produced his military identification card, holding it out plainly for Nolan to examine, though the officer barely glanced at it before waving it away with obvious dismissiveness. Elias remained composed throughout, his voice never once rising above a calm, measured tone, even as the tension surrounding them all continued thickening with every passing second on that wet street corner. He stated plainly, without theatrics, that the officer standing before him had just struck an innocent citizen without any justifiable cause, and that such an action carried consequences reaching far beyond a simple misunderstanding. Nolan, clearly irritated by this quiet challenge to his authority, snapped back with a sharp warning, telling Elias to leave the scene immediately before he too found himself placed under arrest that evening. The crowd gathered along the sidewalk seemed to hold its collective breath, phones still recording steadily, waiting anxiously to see how this composed, uniformed stranger might respond to such an overt and public threat. Elias did not raise his fists, and he did not shout back or attempt any physical intervention, despite every instinct honed across 18 years of demanding combat training, urging him strongly toward action. Instead, he simply reached calmly for his own phone. His thumb moving with practiced efficiency across the screen, dialing a number that had absolutely nothing to do with local emergency services or ordinary channels. This time, he was not calling for help from local police at all. He placed a call directly to the Naval Inspector General's office, followed almost immediately by a second call to a legal advisor within the Department of Defense, who had previously handled sensitive matters involving military families and civilian conduct. He forwarded the video footage that several sympathetic bystanders had already sent him, along with the precise GPS coordinates of the scene and a short list of willing witnesses ready to speak on record about everything they had personally observed. A lieutenant colonel picked up the call on the other end, his voice sharpening considerably once he fully understood the nature of the situation being described to him in clipped, precise sentences. Within a matter of minutes, that same growing urgency rippled outward, eventually reaching the local police department through an emergency channel that could not simply be ignored, delayed, or buried quietly in routine paperwork. The police chief, seated at that exact moment in the middle of an unrelated budget meeting downtown, received a note, passed quietly by a nervous aide, her expression shifting rapidly from mild irritation to genuine alarm as she read through the brief details. She rose from her chair without offering a word of explanation to the confused room around her, gathering her coat quickly as she moved toward the door, already dialing dispatch to demand an immediate and thorough update from the scene itself. Meanwhile, the footage captured earlier on that rainy sidewalk had begun circulating rapidly among the small crowd that had personally witnessed the entire incident from start to finish. Multiple angles now existed, each one telling essentially the same undeniable story, showing Amara standing calmly throughout, her hands clearly visible, her posture entirely non-threatening across the full duration of the encounter. None of the footage showed her resisting in any way, none of it showed her raising her voice, and certainly none of it offered any reasonable justification for the sudden strike that had landed hard across her face. Officer Nolan's official report, hastily filed only moments earlier through his radio, claimed instead that Amara had become physically aggressive and had attempted to flee the scene before he was supposedly forced to subdue her. The footage circulating among witnesses told an entirely different and far more damning story, one that internal affairs investigators would have absolutely no choice but to take seriously the moment it reached their desks that night. A civil rights attorney who happened to live only a few blocks away had also arrived at the scene by then, drawn by the growing commotion, and began speaking quietly, with several witnesses, while carefully jotting down notes for what might soon become a formal complaint. Sirens echoed steadily in the distance, growing louder with each passing second, signaling the imminent arrival of someone whose presence would finally begin to bring order to the chaos still unfolding on that rain-slicked street corner. Within the crowd, a young mother holding an umbrella over her son's stroller had already sent the footage from her phone to a local news tip line, unwilling to wait for official channels to catch up with what her own eyes had witnessed firsthand. A retired schoolteacher standing nearby offered to write down her account while the details remained fresh, insisting quietly to anyone who would listen that she had seen Amara comply with every single instruction given to her before the strike occurred. Even a passing cab driver, stopped momentarily by the commotion blocking the street, rolled down his window and added his own brief statement to a detective who approached him for information. Each new witness added another thread to a story that was quickly becoming impossible for anyone to dispute or explain away, with vague claims about protocol or perceived threat. The convenience store itself had grown eerily quiet inside. Employees gathered near the front window, watching the scene unfold, none of them quite able to believe what had happened, just beyond the glass, only minutes earlier that evening. While the department scrambled internally to formulate some kind of response, a quieter story had already begun circulating among those who recognized the distinctive uniform Elias wore, whispers passing steadily from one onlooker to another about who exactly this composed stranger might actually be. It gradually emerged, through hushed conversation among the crowd, that Commander Elias Grant had served more than 18 years as a Navy SEAL, decorated multiple times throughout his long career for actions that remained largely classified and unknown to the general public. He had pulled wounded teammates from collapsing structures during dangerous overseas operations, had led difficult missions under conditions most bystanders could scarcely begin to imagine, and had earned a strong reputation among his peers for remaining unshaken no matter how dire the circumstances around him became. What struck many of the bystanders most powerfully, however, was not simply his impressive record of service, but the remarkable restraint he continued displaying even now, in a moment when lesser men might easily have let fury take complete control of their actions. He never once used his rank or his hard-earned reputation as leverage against the officers, never postured or issued threats, despite having every conceivable justification to do so, given the circumstances surrounding his wife. His only request, spoken quietly and repeatedly to the officers, and to anyone else willing to listen closely, remained simple and direct throughout. "Treat my wife the way you would treat any other citizen standing on this street tonight," he said evenly. Several people within the gathered crowd began to applaud softly at his words, visibly moved by the quiet dignity of a man who refused to let understandable anger dictate his actions, even after watching his own wife struck in front of him. A retired firefighter standing near the back of the crowd remarked quietly to his wife that he had spent 30 years around emergency responders and had rarely seen anyone carry themselves with such controlled restraint under circumstances that would have justified far more forceful action. A teenager, who had been recording the entire scene on his phone, later admitted that he had expected the encounter to turn violent the moment the uniformed stranger stepped out of his vehicle, and that watching him instead speak calmly and reach for his phone had genuinely surprised him. Even Keegan, standing slightly apart from his partner, seemed visibly unsettled by the composure on display, glancing repeatedly toward Nolan, as though hoping his partner might finally recognize how badly the situation had already spiraled beyond any reasonable justification. Amara, though still shaken from the blow she had received minutes earlier, found herself steadied by her husband's calm presence beside her, drawing quiet strength from the fact that he had not once let his own anger overtake his judgment despite everything he had just witnessed. It was a small moment, easily overlooked amid the larger drama unfolding on that street corner, but it would later be remembered by many of those present as the turning point where the entire tone of the encounter began to shift toward accountability rather than further confrontation. It was around this same time that someone in the crowd suggested pulling footage directly from the convenience store's own security cameras, a detail that would prove absolutely decisive in the hours that followed that evening. The store manager, visibly shaken by everything he had witnessed unfold through his front window, agreed immediately, without hesitation, leading two newly arrived detectives inside to review the recordings without any delay. The footage confirmed everything the crowd had already suspected all along, showing with total clarity that Amara bore no meaningful resemblance whatsoever to the vague description broadcast over dispatch earlier that same evening. It also showed, in painstaking and unmistakable detail, exactly how Officer Nolan had steadily escalated an already tense situation, ignoring every reasonable opportunity to de-escalate in favor of aggressive commands and unnecessary physical intimidation. Internal Affairs, now fully engaged and moving with unusual speed, acted swiftly to place both Nolan and Keegan on administrative leave, pending a complete and formal investigation into the entire incident. The store manager approached Amara directly not long afterward, his voice trembling slightly as he offered a sincere apology for what had happened just outside his own business that evening. Nearby, a young female officer who had arrived with the second wave of responding units stood quietly beside her patrol vehicle, tears streaming steadily down her face as she watched the scene continue unraveling further around her. Officer Nolan attempted repeatedly to salvage the deteriorating situation, offering a string of justifications about following standard protocol and responding appropriately to what he insisted had been a credible threat, one that, according to every single witness present, had never actually existed in reality. His words fell flat and hollow against the mounting evidence, the widely circulated footage, and the visible mark still lingering clearly on Amara's cheek, a mark that no explanation he offered could reasonably account for. Detectives methodically took statements from multiple witnesses at the scene, each account aligning closely and consistently with the video evidence that had already begun circulating widely among increasingly concerned residents nearby. The police chief herself arrived personally within the hour, her expression grim and unreadable as she surveyed the entire scene and spoke briefly with both Elias and Amara before finally addressing her own uniformed officers directly. She made it unmistakably clear, in front of everyone present that evening, that the department would not tolerate the kind of conduct that had just been publicly displayed on that street corner. Amara, for her part, remained remarkably composed throughout this entire lengthy exchange, answering every question calmly and refusing to exaggerate or dramatize anything that had already been fully captured on camera regardless. By the time the steady rain finally began to ease off into a light mist, the truth of what had happened that evening was no longer in serious question for anyone who had personally witnessed it unfold. Several days later, the police department called a formal press conference, gathering reporters, community leaders, and concerned residents inside a crowded room at City Hall to address the incident directly and publicly. The chief stood at the podium, her voice steady but visibly heavy with the weight of accountability, offering a sincere public apology to Amara Brooks and to the broader community affected by what had occurred. She acknowledged plainly, without hedging or deflecting blame elsewhere, that her officers had used excessive force and had clearly violated established protocol regarding the proper treatment of civilians during any routine stop or detainment. Reporters shifted restlessly in their seats, pens moving quickly across notepads, as the chief detailed the immediate suspension of both officers pending further comprehensive review by the department's Internal Affairs Division. When it finally came time for Amara to speak, the entire room fell into an expectant hush, many assuming she would demand harsh punishment or express open anger toward the men who had struck her that night. Instead, she stepped calmly forward to the microphone and spoke words that genuinely surprised nearly everyone gathered within that crowded room. "I want a better system," she said quietly but firmly, "not more victims added to a growing list." The room erupted into sustained applause, many rising from their seats entirely, visibly moved by the grace and clarity of a woman who had every reasonable justification to demand vengeance, yet chose instead to ask only for meaningful, lasting change. As the press conference gradually drew to a close, Elias stepped forward quietly and gently took his wife's hand, guiding her carefully away from the podium and out through the crowd of reporters, still calling out follow-up questions behind them both. Neither of them spoke further to the cameras still trailing them, choosing instead to let her words stand entirely on their own without any further embellishment or additional commentary. Outside, the evening air felt noticeably lighter somehow, the accumulated tension of recent days beginning to loosen its grip on both of them as they walked together slowly toward their parked car. Amara glanced briefly toward her husband, offering him a small, visibly tired smile that carried far more relief within it than either of them could easily put into simple words. He squeezed her hand gently in response, saying nothing at all, understanding instinctively that some moments called for quiet silence rather than any further reassurance. The crowd gathered outside City Hall watched them go, many still quietly processing the remarkable composure this couple had displayed throughout an ordeal that would have understandably broken many other people entirely. It was clear to everyone present that evening that this difficult story, though painful in its original circumstances, was slowly transforming into something far more meaningful and lasting than a simple isolated case of misconduct. Local news outlets picked up the story quickly in the days that followed, and reporters from surrounding counties began requesting interviews with anyone connected to the incident, though Amara politely declined most of these requests, choosing instead to let the official investigation run its course without unnecessary distraction. A few civic organizations reached out as well, offering support and resources, and while Amara appreciated the gestures, she remained cautious about attaching her name to causes she had not fully vetted or considered carefully beforehand. Alias, for his part, remained almost entirely out of the public conversation, content to let his wife's composed dignity speak for both of them, rather than inserting his own voice into a story that was never really about him in the first place. Their small circle of close friends rallied around them quietly during those first difficult weeks, bringing meals and offering company without ever pressing for details. Neither of them felt ready to share just yet. The couple's quiet approach to the unfolding attention, avoiding spectacle, and refusing every opportunity for public grandstanding, only seemed to deepen the respect the broader community held for them as the weeks continued to pass. In the weeks that followed, community members continued to reach out quietly to Amara, some sharing their own past experiences, others simply thanking her for the calm dignity she had shown throughout such a painful public ordeal. She found herself, somewhat unexpectedly, becoming a kind of steady voice within conversations about fairness and accountability, though she never sought that role for herself and remained cautious about accepting too much attention. Elias, meanwhile, continued quietly supporting her from the background, attending several meetings alongside her without ever once trying to steer the conversation or claim credit for anything happening around them. Their neighbors noticed a subtle shift in the couple as well, a quiet resilience that seemed to grow steadily stronger with each passing week, rather than diminishing under the weight of what they had endured together. Colleagues at Amara's firm offered their support in smaller, practical ways, adjusting her workload gently during the more demanding weeks of interviews and follow-up meetings with investigators. Through it all, Amara insisted repeatedly that she did not want sympathy directed toward herself specifically, but rather genuine attention paid toward fixing the deeper systemic issues that had allowed such an encounter to spiral so badly out of control in the first place. It was this consistent, unwavering focus on improvement, rather than personal grievance, that continued earning her quiet respect from even the most skeptical observers following the unfolding story closely. In the months that followed, the consequences of that single rainy evening continued unfolding in ways that reached far beyond the immediate boundaries of the original incident itself. Officer Travis Nolan was formally terminated from the department entirely, and the investigation's detailed findings were forwarded onward for further legal review regarding the full extent of his conduct that night. Officer Bryce Keegan received substantial disciplinary action as well, required to undergo extensive retraining, focused specifically on de-escalation techniques and the appropriate use of authority during routine civilian encounters going forward. The police department itself implemented sweeping structural changes to its existing protocols. Again, received substantial disciplinary action as well, required to undergo extensive retraining, focused specifically on de-escalation techniques and the appropriate use of authority during routine civilian encounters going forward. The police department itself implemented sweeping structural changes to its existing protocols, adopting entirely new guidelines around the use of force and mandating updated, mandatory training aimed at reducing unnecessary escalation during ordinary traffic and pedestrian stops. Amara was invited formally to join an advisory program focused on civil rights and effective communication practices within law enforcement interactions, a role she accepted with the same quiet, steady determination she had shown throughout the entire ordeal from its very beginning. She spent her weekends now working alongside community leaders and department representatives, helping to carefully shape new policies that might help prevent another family from ever experiencing what she herself had endured that night. It was slow, deliberate, often frustrating work, but it was work she believed in deeply, work that gave real and lasting meaning to the pain she had carried since that cold autumn evening outside the convenience store. Elias, meanwhile, prepared steadily to return to active duty once his brief leave finally came to its scheduled end, the demanding responsibilities of his service pulling him back once again toward duties that extended far beyond the walls of his own household. On the evening before his departure, the two of them walked slowly together along the quiet harbor, the salt-tinged air cool and refreshing against their skin, as the last light of day faded gradually over the calm water. Neither of them spoke for several long, comfortable minutes, content simply to walk side by side, listening quietly to the gentle rhythm of small waves lapping steadily against the wooden pilings beneath the pier. Elias finally broke the peaceful silence between them, his voice quiet but entirely honest, acknowledging a difficult truth that had weighed steadily on him since that terrible night outside the convenience store, weeks earlier. "I cannot control everything that happens out there," he admitted quietly, glancing off toward the darkening horizon where the sea met the fading evening sky. Amara turned gently to face him, her expression calm and steady, her eyes reflecting the last faint traces of golden light, still clinging softly to the water's edge nearby. "But we can always choose how we face it," she replied softly, her voice carrying the same steady strength that had guided her faithfully through every difficult moment of the past several demanding weeks. He nodded slowly in response, pulling her gently into a warm embrace, both of them standing quietly together as the sun finally dipped fully below the distant horizon, its last warm glow spreading gently across the calm surface of the harbor before them. Before he left the following morning, Elias paused once more at the front door, turning back to look at his wife, standing quietly in the soft morning light filtering through their kitchen window. He told her, simply and without any grand gestures, that watching her handle everything with such steady grace had taught him something new about strength, something no amount of training or combat experience had ever quite shown him before. Amara smiled at that, reaching up to straighten the collar of his uniform with practiced, familiar hands, telling him gently that she had simply followed his example without even realizing it at the time. They stood together for a long moment, in comfortable silence, two people who understood each other completely, without needing many words to bridge the space between them. When he finally stepped out toward his waiting vehicle, she watched from the doorway until he was completely out of sight, her hand resting lightly against the doorframe, her heart steady and calm, despite the familiar ache of another goodbye. Inside the house, the morning light continued to spread slowly across the quiet kitchen, illuminating a small photograph of the two of them resting on the counter, a reminder of everything they had already weathered together, and everything still waiting patiently ahead. In the fading autumn light of that departure, two people who had faced something terrible together stood unshaken still, bound not by anger or lingering bitterness, but by a quiet, enduring resolve to meet whatever came next with their dignity fully intact. Together, exactly as they always had. Weeks turned into months, and the story that had begun with a single slap on a rain-soaked street corner gradually settled into something quieter, something closer to a lasting lesson than a lingering wound. Amara continued her advisory work steadily, sitting through long meetings with department officials who had once seemed distant and unreachable, but who now listened carefully to every suggestion she brought to the table. She found unexpected satisfaction in watching new recruits go through updated training sessions. Sessions built in part around the very footage that had once captured the worst moment of her life, now repurposed as a tool for teaching restraint rather than a symbol of harm. Colleagues who had once known her only as the calm, capable woman down the hall began to see a new dimension to her character, one shaped by resilience rather than defined by victimhood. She still thought of that evening often, the cold rain, the sting across her cheek, the sound of her own voice speaking her husband's name into the phone, but the memory no longer carried the same sharp edge it once had. Instead, it had become something closer to a marker, a point in her life after which she had chosen, deliberately and repeatedly, to turn pain into purpose, rather than allowing it to harden into resentment. Elias returned from his next deployment several months later, older by a season of hard work but unchanged in the steady calm that had carried him through that difficult evening outside the convenience store. He found his wife waiting for him at the harbor, exactly where they had stood together the night before his departure, the same salt air drifting across the water, the same gentle rhythm of waves against the pilings beneath their feet. Neither of them needed to say much in that first quiet reunion, content simply to stand together again, watching the same fading light spread slowly across the calm water they had come to think of as their own private meeting place. Amara told him briefly about the progress made within the department, the new training programs, the revised protocols, the slow but steady shift in culture that seemed to be taking root among officers who had once seemed resistant to any kind of change. Elias listened closely, nodding occasionally, proud in a quiet way that needed no grand declaration to be understood between them. When he finally spoke, he told her simply that of all the missions he had completed in his many years of service, none had taught him more about courage than watching his wife stand calm and steady in the face of something meant to break her. She smiled at that, reaching for his hand as the last light faded fully over the water, both of them content in the knowledge that whatever storms still waited ahead, they would face them exactly as they always had, together, unshaken, and unwilling to let fear or bitterness have the final word. Long after that evening at the harbor, people in Charleston still spoke occasionally of the rainy night outside the convenience store, though the story had changed shape over time, softened at its edges, remembered now less for the pain it had caused, and more for the quiet strength it had revealed in two people who refused to let a single act of cruelty define the rest of their lives. Amara's name came up in department training sessions for years afterward, not as a symbol of grievance, but as a reminder of what calm, steady resolve could accomplish even in the darkest of moments. Elias carried the lesson with him too, back into his demanding work, back into rooms filled with younger sailors who had never heard the full story, but who noticed, all the same, the particular kind of steadiness in their commander that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than training alone could provide. And on quiet evenings, when the rain returned to Charleston, as it always eventually did, Amara sometimes found herself standing near a window, watching the drops trace their slow paths down the glass, grateful not for what had happened to her, but for everything that had grown, deliberately and patiently, in its aftermath.